The sweet aroma of garlic bread and marinara sauce filled the air at Bella's Corner, a cozy Italian restaurant nestled in downtown Seattle. It was supposed to be just another Friday night celebration, the kind where friends gather, share laughs, and make memories. For Ashley Chen, a 19-year-old art student at Seattle University, this birthday dinner for her best friend meant everything. After weeks of intense final exams and sleepless nights, they all needed this break. The restaurant buzzed with the cheerful noise of clinking glasses and friendly chatter. Ashley and her 4 friends had squeezed into a corner booth, their table cluttered with half-empty plates of fettuccine and margarita pizza. String lights twinkled overhead, casting a warm glow on their faces as they shared stories and inside jokes. "Remember when Professor Thompson caught me drawing cartoons in his economics class?" Ashley giggled, twirling her straw in her glass of lemon water. Her friend Lily nearly choked on her breadstick, trying to hold back laughter. The whole group erupted in fits of giggles, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. The night felt perfect, almost too perfect. None of them could have guessed that in just a few hours, their names would be splashed across news headlines and social media feeds across the country. They were just college students enjoying a simple dinner, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. As the evening progressed, more customers filled the restaurant. The smell of fresh-baked tiramisu wafted from the kitchen, mixing with the sound of Dean Martin's classics playing softly in the background. Ashley checked her phone, 10:45 p.m. They'd been chatting for nearly 3 hours, but it felt like minutes. "We should probably head out soon," Lily suggested, glancing at her watch. "My morning class tomorrow is going to be rough enough already." The others nodded in agreement, gathering their belongings and fishing out their wallets to split the bill. Their waitress, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair, brought their check with 5 mint chocolates. "You girls be careful out there," she said with a grandmother's warmth. "It's getting late, and sometimes the downtown crowd can get a little rowdy on weekends." If only they had known how prophetic those words would become. Outside, the Seattle night air was crisp and cool, typical for early spring. The street lamps cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and the distant sound of traffic created a familiar urban symphony. They decided to walk together to the parking garage 2 blocks away, where they had left their cars. The group huddled close, walking arm in arm, still bubbling with laughter from their dinner conversations. The streets weren't empty, but they weren't crowded either, just the usual mix of late-night workers, couples heading home from dates, and the occasional group of friends like themselves. "This was exactly what we needed," Ashley said, breathing in the night air. Her friend Riley nodded in agreement, adjusting her backpack strap. "We should do this more often. Life's been so serious lately." They passed by a few closed shops, their windows dark and reflective. A street musician was packing up his guitar for the night, the last few coins in his case catching the light from above. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. That's when they heard the police siren, just a quick whoop, the kind officers use to get someone's attention. None of them thought much of it at first. Police cars were common downtown. But then came the sharp voice behind them. "Hey, you girls, stop right there." The group turned around, confused but not particularly worried. They hadn't done anything wrong after all. In the glow of the street lights, they could see a police officer stepping out of his patrol car, his face hidden in shadow. None of them could have predicted what would happen next. None of them imagined that this simple moment, this ordinary pause in an ordinary evening, would spark a chain of events that would expose corruption, challenge authority, and ultimately change the face of law enforcement in their city. As the officer approached, Ashley felt a slight chill run down her spine. Maybe it was the way he walked, or maybe it was just the cold night air. Either way, something felt off. She gripped her friend's arm a little tighter, forcing a polite smile onto her face. Little did she know, her life was about to intersect with a dark side of law enforcement that most people only read about in newspapers. And in the coming days, her story would become much bigger than herself. It would become a catalyst for change that nobody saw coming. Officer Thomas Davidson was having a bad night. His divorce papers had arrived that morning, his teenage son wasn't speaking to him, and now he had to respond to yet another noise complaint downtown. 17 years on the force had left him bitter, his once idealistic vision of police work corroded by years of what he saw as thankless service. The group of young women stood frozen under the streetlight, their earlier laughter evaporating into the cool night air. Ashley could feel her heart pounding as the officer approached, his boots clicking against the concrete with deliberate slowness. Something about his body language set off warning bells in her mind. "Let me see some ID," Davidson barked, not bothering with introductions or explanations. His flashlight beam jumped from face to face, making the girls squint. "You all look underage to me, and I bet you've been drinking." Riley, always the composed one, stepped forward with her driver's license already in hand. "Officer, we were just having dinner at Bella's. None of us have been drinking. We're all college students." Davidson snatched the license from her hand, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. The way his lips curled into a sneer made Ashley's stomach turn. She'd heard stories about police officers who abused their power, but she'd always assumed those were rare exceptions. "Right," he scoffed, shining his flashlight directly into Riley's eyes. "And I'm the Easter Bunny. You think I haven't heard every excuse in the book? You kids think you can just run around my streets, making noise, disturbing the peace. Your streets?" Lily whispered under her breath, immediately regretting it when Davidson's head snapped toward her. "What was that?" he demanded, taking a step closer. The girls instinctively moved back, bumping into each other. "You got something to say to me?" A small crowd was beginning to gather at a safe distance. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Ashley noticed this and felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that there were witnesses, anxiety about what might happen next. "Officer, please," Ashley spoke up, her voice steadier than she felt. "We can show you our receipts from dinner. We literally just left the restaurant. You can call them to verify." Davidson's attention shifted to Ashley, his eyes narrowing. We've got another lawyer here, do we? Another kid who knows their rights?" He took another step forward, invading her personal space. The smell of coffee and cigarettes on his breath made her want to gag. More patrol cars were pulling up now, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. But instead of feeling safer, Ashley felt her anxiety spike. None of the other officers seemed interested in intervening. "Listen," Davidson continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I've been dealing with smart-mouthed college kids like you for longer than you've been alive. You think because Daddy pays your tuition, you can talk to me however you want." Ashley's friends huddled closer together, their phones now out too, recording everything. The growing crowd of onlookers had swelled to at least 20 people. Someone in the back shouted, "Leave them alone. They're just kids." Davidson spun around, searching for the voice in the crowd. When he turned back, his face was flushed with anger. He reached for something on his belt, and Ashley felt her breath catch in her throat. But instead of his weapon, he grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, I'm going to need backup at 5th and Pine. Got a group of suspicious individuals, possible public intoxication, gathering crowd becoming hostile." "We're not intoxicated," Riley protested, her voice cracking with frustration. "This is harassment. We know our rights." That was when Davidson spotted something that made his eyes light up with cruel satisfaction, an empty beer bottle sitting on top of a nearby recycling bin. What happened next would be replayed on news channels across the country, but in that moment, time seemed to slow down for Ashley and her friends. None of them could have known that just 3 blocks away, an off-duty news reporter was walking her dog, about to stumble upon a scene that would launch her next big story. None of them could have guessed that Officer Davidson's body camera, which he would later claim malfunctioned, had actually been deliberately turned off 5 minutes earlier. And nobody, especially not Officer Davidson, could have imagined that this routine stop would not only end his career, but would spark a movement that would reshape police departments across the entire state. The recycling bin's metal edge gleamed under the streetlight as Officer Davidson reached for the empty beer bottle. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were performing for the growing crowd of onlookers. The glass caught the light, throwing scattered reflections across the concerned faces of Ashley's friends. "Since you ladies insist you haven't been drinking," Davidson announced, his voice carrying across the now-silent street, "let's do a little field test, my own special version." The cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth made Ashley's blood run cold. A woman in the crowd shouted, "Someone call 911." The irony of calling the police on the police wasn't lost on anyone. Several people had their phones raised high, documenting every moment. The red and blue lights from the patrol cars created an eerie dance of shadows across the scene. "Officer, please." Riley stepped forward, her law student instincts kicking in. "This is completely unauthorized and illegal. You can't." "Can't what?" Davidson cut her off, taking a menacing step forward. "Can't protect the public from drunk college kids disturbing the peace. Can't do my job." His voice rose with each question, spittle flying from his lips. Ashley tried to back away, but found herself trapped between Davidson and a parked car. Her heart hammered against her ribs as he raised the bottle. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more urgent. Someone was live streaming everything to social media, the video that would later go viral and spark nationwide outrage. "Open up," Davidson commanded, his face inches from Ashley's. When she kept her mouth firmly shut, his free hand shot out, fingers digging into her cheeks. Years of martial arts training with her father flashed through Ashley's mind, but she forced herself to stay still. Fighting back would only make things worse. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but to everyone watching, it felt like slow motion. Davidson, his patience snapping, tried to force the bottle toward Ashley's mouth. She struggled, turning her head away. Her friends screamed, their voices mixing with the shouts from the crowd. "Stop it." Lily lunged forward, only to be held back by another officer who had finally approached the scene. "You're hurting her." The bottle's glass edge scraped against Ashley's teeth, cold and threatening. Tears streamed down her face, not from pain, but from humiliation and fear. Through it all, she could hear the clicks and beeps of dozens of phones recording, documenting every second of her nightmare. Then came the voice that would change everything, clear, authoritative, and furious. "What in God's name is going on here?" The crowd parted like the Red Sea, revealing a middle-aged woman in a pressed suit, her press badge catching the light. Catherine Wu, senior investigative reporter for the Seattle Times, had been walking her dog when she heard the commotion. Her trained eye took in every detail: the young women's dinner clothes, their obvious fear, the officer's aggressive stance, the empty bottle. Davidson's grip loosened slightly at the interruption, but his face showed no remorse. "Media has no business interfering with police work," he growled, but there was a new note in his voice: uncertainty. "Police work?" Catherine's voice could have cut glass. "I've covered the force for 20 years, officer. This isn't police work. This is assault." She had her own phone out now, already dialing numbers she knew by heart. The other officers began to shift uncomfortably. One finally stepped forward, putting a hand on Davidson's shoulder. "Tom, maybe we should." But before he could finish, Ashley's phone rang. The sound sliced through the tension like a knife. Despite Davidson's grip, she could see the caller ID, Dad. Nobody on that street, not Officer Davidson, not the watching crowd, not even Ashley herself, knew that her father had just left an emergency meeting with the police commissioner. Nobody knew that he'd received a text from one of Riley's relatives who recognized Ashley in the live stream that was already going viral. And absolutely nobody knew that in his office downtown, Judge Chen was seeing his worst nightmare play out through his computer screen, his daughter being assaulted by the very people he trusted to protect and serve. The next few moments would become the most watched video clip of the year. It would be analyzed on news programs, discussed in law schools, and used in police training academies as an example of everything that could go wrong. But right then, in that moment, all Ashley could think about was the fear in her father's voice as he said her name through the phone speaker, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ashley? Honey, are you okay? Put that officer on the phone, right now." The color drained from Davidson's face as realization began to dawn. He had no idea that his routine stop was about to become the catalyst for the biggest police reform movement in state history. Judge Michael Chen's hands trembled as he watched the live stream on his computer screen. He'd seen countless cases of police misconduct over his 25 years on the bench, but nothing had prepared him for seeing his own daughter being assaulted. The leather chair in his chambers creaked as he leaned forward, his phone pressed to his ear. "I said put him on the phone, Ashley," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of judicial authority. In the background of the call, he could hear the murmur of the crowd, the shuffling of feet, the nervous breathing of the officers who had no idea what was about to hit them. Back on the street, Officer Davidson's grip on Ashley had loosened, but his arrogance hadn't completely faded. "Who exactly am I speaking to?" he asked, taking the phone with an exaggerated eye roll. The crowd held its collective breath, phones still recording every moment. "This is Federal Judge Michael Chen." The words fell like hammer blows in the night air. "Badge number 8294, Officer Davidson, correct? I'm looking at your personnel file right now." The change in Davidson's demeanor was instant and dramatic. The color drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug. His hand, still holding the beer bottle, dropped to his side. The other officers took involuntary steps backward, suddenly very interested in their shoes. "Sir, I was just conducting a routine," Davidson stammered, but Judge Chen cut him off. "A routine assault on my daughter? A routine violation of civil rights? Or perhaps a routine abuse of power?" The judge's voice was calm but carried a steel edge that made even the low-stream viewers shiver. "I spent the last 6 months heading the Police Oversight Committee, Officer Davidson. Would you like to guess what's on my desk right now?" Catherine Wu, the reporter, had edged closer, her professional instincts telling her this was bigger than she'd initially thought. Her phone was already sending rapid-fire texts to her editor. "The thing is, Officer Davidson," Judge Chen continued, his voice now carrying through the phone speaker for all to hear, "I've been reviewing complaints about excessive force in our department. Fascinating reading. Your name appears with remarkable frequency." The other officers were now openly backing away from Davidson. One was urgently speaking into his radio, and in the distance, new sirens could be heard approaching. The crowd had grown even larger, with people passing phones around, sharing the identity of who was on the other end of that call. "My daughter was having dinner with her friends." Judge Chen's voice remained steady. "They had receipts. They had IDs. They were walking to their cars. And you decided to make an example of them? To abuse your authority? To physically assault a young woman?" Ashley watched as her father's words stripped away Davidson's authority layer by layer. The same man who had been so threatening moments ago now looked small, almost deflated. She felt Riley's arm around her shoulders, supporting her as the adrenaline began to wear off. "Internal Affairs will be here in approximately 3 minutes," Judge Chen informed everyone listening. "I suggest you stay exactly where you are, Officer Davidson. We have quite a lot to discuss about your interpretation of proper police procedure." The approaching sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights appeared at both ends of the street, but these weren't regular patrol cars. Black SUVs with government plates pulled up, and men in suits stepped out, their badges catching the streetlights. Catherine Wu was already composing the opening lines of her story in her head. In a stunning turn of events, what began as harassment of college students revealed a deeper pattern of police misconduct, leading straight to the desk of the city's most prominent judicial figure. The crowd watched in fascination as Davidson was asked to surrender his badge and weapon. The other officers, now eager to distance themselves from their colleague, began giving statements to the arriving Internal Affairs investigators. Ashley's phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Stay there. I'm on my way." Nobody on that street could have predicted how this night would reshape the city's approach to law enforcement. Nobody knew that this incident would become the turning point in Judge Chen's crusade for police reform. And Officer Davidson, still holding Ashley's phone limply in his hand, had no idea that his routine stop had just triggered the largest internal investigation in the department's history. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Ashley looked around at her friends, at the watching crowd, at the officers giving statements, and at Davidson's pale, sweating face. She thought about all the people who had faced similar situations but didn't have a federal judge for a father. In that moment, she made a decision that would shape her future career path. This story wouldn't end with just one officer's misconduct. It would become a catalyst for real change. By sunrise, the video had exploded across the internet. Ashley's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications as millions of people shared the footage of her ordeal. Local news stations had it on repeat, and national networks were picking up the story. The headlines were everywhere. Judge's daughter assaulted by police officer, cop's power trip backfires. Police reform takes personal turn for federal judge. In her family's kitchen, Ashley sat with an untouched cup of tea, watching her father pace back and forth. Judge Chen hadn't slept all night, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a mix of anger and guilt. "I've seen cases like this cross my desk for years," he said, running a hand through his graying hair. "But I never imagined." "Dad, it's not your fault," Ashley said softly, though her hands still trembled slightly when she reached for her cup. The events of the previous night kept replaying in her mind like a bad movie she couldn't turn off. The morning news played quietly on the kitchen TV. Reporter Catherine Wu's face filled the screen as she stood outside the police station. Sources inside the department reveal that Officer Davidson had 17 previous complaints filed against him, all of which were mysteriously cleared or buried. The question now is, how many other officers have similar records? Ashley's phone lit up with another message from Riley. "Have you seen TikTok? The video hit 5 million views in just 6 hours. People are organizing a protest for this afternoon." The doorbell rang, making Ashley jump. Her mother went to answer it, returning with 2 serious-looking detectives from Internal Affairs. They wanted to take Ashley's official statement, but Judge Chen insisted their family lawyer be present first. "Your story is trending worldwide," one detective explained, showing them his phone. #police brutality and #justice for Ashley were the top trending topics. The department is facing unprecedented pressure for reform. As they waited for their lawyer to arrive, Ashley scrolled through her social media. The support was overwhelming. People from all over the world were sharing their own stories of police encounters gone wrong. But what caught her attention were the messages from other young women her age, thanking her for standing strong, for not backing down. "Look at this, Dad," she said, showing him a particular post. It was from a law student in Oregon. "Watching that video made me realize why I want to become a civil rights attorney. If this can happen to a judge's daughter, imagine what happens to those without powerful connections." Judge Chen's phone rang, the police commissioner wanting another emergency meeting. But before he left, he hugged Ashley tightly. "We're going to fix this," he promised. "Not just for you, but for everyone." By afternoon, the local news was covering the gathering crowd outside police headquarters. Hundreds of people held signs reading, "No more power trips and reform now." Riley and their other friends were there, speaking to reporters about what they'd witnessed. Catherine Wu's investigation was gaining momentum. Her latest report revealed a pattern of similar incidents that had been swept under the rug. The police union was scrambling to distance itself from Davidson, while reform advocates were using the incident to push for major policy changes. Ashley's mother brought her another cup of tea, this one she actually drank. "The university president called," she said. "They want you to speak at a forum on police reform next week, but only if you feel ready." Looking at the TV coverage of the protests, Ashley felt something shift inside her. The fear and humiliation from last night were still there, but they were being transformed into something else: determination. She thought about all the other victims who didn't have viral videos or powerful parents to protect them. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unexpected source: Officer Chen, one of the younger cops who had been present last night. "I wanted you to know that some of us are speaking up. What happened to you was wrong. We need change from the inside too." The family lawyer arrived just as Judge Chen was leaving for his meeting. "Are you ready?" she asked Ashley, setting up her laptop to record the official statement. Ashley looked at the protesters on TV, at her mother's supportive smile, at the messages flooding her phone. She thought about the beer bottle, about Davidson's sneer, about her father's voice cutting through the night. She thought about all the people now looking to her story as a catalyst for change. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready to tell my story. All of it." As she began to speak, news helicopters circled overhead, covering the growing protest. Social media counters ticked up by the thousands. In police precincts across the city, officers were being called into emergency meetings about conduct and accountability. And in the commissioner's office, Judge Chen was about to present a comprehensive reform proposal that had been sitting in his drawer for months, waiting for the right moment. The aftermath of that night was growing into something bigger than any of them had imagined. It wasn't just about one bad officer anymore, it was about changing an entire system, And it all started because someone decided to record a video of a routine stop gone wrong. The Internal Affairs Office buzzed with unusual energy that morning. Detective Lisa Parker sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of personnel files, her computer screen showing the now infamous video that had sparked the biggest investigation of her career. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the rush of new revelations. "You need to see this," her partner called from across the room. He waved a folder that looked older than both of them combined. The label read, Davidson T. Civilian Complaints, 2008 to 2015. The folder was thick enough to be a novel. How did we miss this? Lisa muttered, flipping through page after page of complaints. Each one told a similar story: excessive force, abuse of power, intimidation. But every single complaint had been marked unfounded or insufficient evidence. Her phone lit up with a text from Catherine Wu, the reporter who'd broken the story. "Found something big. Meet me at the usual place." Lisa grabbed her jacket. After 20 years on the force, she knew when a case was about to crack wide open. At the small coffee shop 3 blocks from the station, Catherine was already waiting, her laptop open and a determined look on her face. "Remember Officer Chen? The young one who was there that night? He's been talking, and he's not the only one." The evidence was damning. Davidson hadn't worked alone. There was an unofficial network of senior officers who protected their own, buried complaints, and intimidated witnesses. They called themselves the Old Guard, and they'd been operating for years. Back at the station, Chief Thompson was holding an emergency press conference. The usual confidence was gone from his voice as cameras flashed. "We are conducting a thorough investigation into these allegations. The department is committed to full transparency." In his office, Judge Chen reviewed the mounting evidence with a grim expression. The incident with Ashley had cracked open something much bigger than one rogue officer. The corruption went deep, tangled in years of silence and cover-ups. Ashley, meanwhile, had become an unexpected symbol of change. Her phone rang with calls from other victims, each with their own story to tell. "I was too scared to speak up before," one woman told her, voice shaking. "But seeing your video, seeing you stand up to him, it gave me courage." Officer Chen sat in interview room 3, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of water. "The Old Guard, they had their own rules," he explained to Lisa. "If you wanted to keep your job, you learned to look the other way. But what happened to Ashley? That was the last straw for many of us." The investigation spread like wildfire through the department. Junior officers, long silenced by fear and tradition, began to speak up. Each new testimony revealed another layer of misconduct, another buried complaint, another victim who'd been pressured into silence. Catherine's articles were now running daily in the paper. Police culture under microscope. How deep does the corruption go? The story had grown beyond Davidson, beyond Ashley, into something that threatened to reshape the entire department. Lisa's office whiteboard was covered in names and connections, a web of corruption that stretched back years. Red strings connected officers to incidents, to cover-ups, to witnesses who'd suddenly changed their stories. At the center was Davidson's name, but he was just the tip of the iceberg. "Look at this pattern," she told her partner, pointing to a cluster of complaints from 2012. Same officers, same types of incidents, same mysterious disappearing evidence. This wasn't random. This was systematic. The police union was in chaos. Half their leadership had been implicated in the cover-ups. Young officers were calling for reform, for new leadership, for a complete overhaul of the complaint system. Judge Chen's phone rang late one night. It was the police commissioner, sounding tired and defeated. "We found more files, Michael. Hidden files. This goes all the way to the top. We're going to need a special prosecutor." Ashley sat in her family's living room, watching the news coverage of yet another officer coming forward with evidence. The reporter was saying something about the biggest police corruption scandal in state history. "Did you ever imagine," her mother asked softly, "that your video would lead to all this?" Ashley thought about that night, about Davidson's smirk, about the beer bottle. She thought about all the other victims who'd been silenced over the years, about Officer Chen finding the courage to speak up, about the young officers pushing for change. "Someone had to break the silence," she said, reaching for her mother's hand. "I just never thought it would be me." Outside, protesters still gathered daily, but their signs had changed. Now they read, "Thank you, Ashley," and "True change coming." The investigation had become a movement, and the movement was becoming a revolution in how police departments handled accountability. Lisa stared at her whiteboard, adding another red string to the web of connections. This case would define her career, maybe even change the whole system. And it all started because one young woman refused to be silenced, and one reporter happened to be walking her dog at exactly the right moment. 6 months had passed since that fateful night. The courtroom was packed as Judge Wilson prepared to announce the verdict in Officer Davidson's trial. Ashley sat in the front row, surrounded by her family and friends, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Davidson looked nothing like the intimidating figure who had terrorized her that night. His uniform was replaced by a gray suit that seemed too big for him now, his arrogance deflated by months of investigation and public scrutiny. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Wilson's voice echoed through the hushed courtroom. The sound of cameras clicking filled the air as Davidson stood, his attorney's hand on his shoulder. The verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. As the judge read through the charges, abuse of power, assault, civil rights violations, Ashley felt tears rolling down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of fear this time. They were tears of relief, of vindication, not just for her, but for all the victims who'd come forward during the investigation. Outside the courthouse, Catherine Wu stood among a sea of reporters, delivering her live broadcast. This verdict marks more than just the end of one officer's career. It represents a fundamental shift in how our city handles police accountability. She was right. The investigation had led to the resignation of 3 police chiefs, 24 officers, and several high-ranking city officials. The old guard network had been exposed and dismantled. But more importantly, real change was happening. Back at police headquarters, newly appointed Chief Patricia Torres was implementing the reforms that had grown out of the scandal. Every officer now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters with the public. A civilian oversight board had real power to investigate complaints. New training programs focused on de-escalation and community relations. Officer Chen, now promoted to sergeant, led these training sessions. "We're learning from our mistakes," he told a room full of cadets, Ashley's video playing on the screen behind him. "This is what happens when we forget who we're meant to serve and protect." The changes spread beyond their city. Police departments across the country were studying what became known as the Chen Reforms, named not after the judge but after Ashley, whose courage had sparked the movement. Ashley herself had found a new purpose. Standing at the podium of her university's law school auditorium, she addressed a packed room. Change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it starts with one person refusing to be silenced, one video that can't be ignored, one moment that forces us all to confront uncomfortable truths. Her father watched from the back of the room, pride mixing with lingering guilt on his face. The incident had changed him too. Judge Chen had stepped down from the bench to lead a national commission on police reform, turning his daughter's trauma into a mission for systemic change. Riley, now in her final year of law school, had started a legal clinic specifically focusing on police accountability cases. Ashley's case taught us that evidence isn't enough, she explained to her volunteers. You need courage, you need support, and you need people willing to stand up and say enough. The street where it all happened looked different now. A small plaque marked the spot, not commemorating the incident itself, but celebrating what came after. Here began a movement for change, sparked by courage and carried forward by hope. Lisa Parker had been promoted to head of internal affairs. Her office whiteboard now displayed a different kind of data: successful interventions, community outreach programs, positive changes in police-citizen interactions. The web of corruption had been replaced by a network of accountability. In a quiet moment at home, Ashley found the notification from that night still saved on her phone, the first viral post of her video. She showed it to her mother, who hugged her tightly. "You turned a nightmare into a wake-up call," her mom whispered. The final report on the department's transformation ran as a special section in the newspaper. Catherine Wu's article ended with a quote from Ashley: "Real change isn't just about punishing bad actions, it's about creating a system where those actions become unthinkable." Davidson's sentencing made national news, but it wasn't the main story anymore. The focus had shifted to the positive changes sweeping through police departments nationwide. Other cities were adopting the reforms that had started here, creating their own civilian oversight boards, implementing new training programs. As Ashley walked across campus that evening, a young police officer nodded respectfully as she passed. She noticed his body camera blinking, his badge number clearly displayed, his demeanor professional but approachable. These small changes, multiplied across thousands of interactions every day, were the real victory. The story that began with a beer bottle and a power trip had transformed into something much bigger. A testament to how one moment of injustice, exposed and confronted, could lead to lasting change. It wasn't just about one night anymore, or one officer, or even one department. It was about reshaping the relationship between those who enforce the law and those they serve, one reform at a time.